We've been looking at the story of the book of Exodus, and in the first week we saw the story, how the story of the book of Exodus is connected with the story of the book of Genesis. How the small family of Jacob that migrates to Egypt grows into a large people, but a time lapse of almost 400 years leads to a very different relationship between these people and the Egyptians, and they become slaves of the Egyptians. And then we saw the story of how Moses was saved from Pharaoh and was actually brought up in the household of Pharaoh, but then flees from Egypt, and at Sinai, God reveals himself to Moses for the first time and sends Moses to free his people from slavery. And in that first week, we saw that Moses was a reluctant hero. He really didn't want to do what God wanted him to do. But the important thing was that God revealed his name to Moses. God's name means I am. I am who I will be. It's a way of saying that Moses and the people of Israel will discover who God is and what God's name really means by the way in which God deals with them and saves them. Last week, we saw the great contest between God on the one hand and Pharaoh. And the contest arose because Pharaoh had abused God's firstborn, the people of Israel. And so we have these series of 10 plagues, all of which are meant to show the power of God, not only to the Israelites, but to the Egyptians and to Moses, and to make it very clear that Yahweh, the Lord, is God and not Pharaoh. And we notice this theme of the hardening of Pharaoh's heart. At the beginning of these 10 plagues, Pharaoh always hardens his heart. Toward the end of it, God even hardens the heart of Pharaoh, till finally Pharaoh understands that the Lord, Yahweh, is God and not he, and he sends the people away. But no sooner does he send the people away than he changes his mind and he pursues them. And then you have the story of the great deliverance, the exodus of the people of Israel at the Red Sea. Now, today we're going to look at two other episodes. The first one is the story of the journey of the people in the wilderness until they come to Mount Sinai. And then the second part that we'll look at begins in chapter 19 and goes through chapter 24, and it is what happens when the people finally come to Mount Sinai and God reveals himself to the people and enters into a covenant with the people. So at this point, God has freed the people, and now the next stage is for God to enter into a covenant, a relationship with this people. So if you just look at the handout, the first section here deals with the different way that Israel contends with Moses and God. And one of the things you would notice in this section as you read through it is the frequent reference to the grumbling of the people, which foreshadows what's going to happen later on when they leave Mount Sinai and wander for 40 years in the wilderness until they come to the promised land. Even though God has freed them in this spectacular way through the Red Sea, they still do not trust God, nor do they trust his servant Moses. So there are 3 episodes where Israel grumbles with Moses. The first is at a place called Marah. And they've only been wandering for a short period of time, and they come to a place where they want to drink the water, and they find that the water is bitter, so they cannot drink it, and they grumble against Moses. I'm in chapter 16, verse 24. What are we to drink? And Moses cries out to the Lord, who points out to him a piece of wood, and he throws it into the water, and the water becomes fresh. So they come to this pool of water, but they can't drink it. They grumble for the first time against Moses. Moses takes a piece of wood, throws it into the water, and that water then becomes drinkable. The early fathers of the church often saw in this a prefiguration of the cross, so that the cross of Christ purifies the waters of baptism by which we are saved. And then, God, still in chapter 15, the last verse, verse 27, God brings them to a place called Elim, where they find 12 springs of water and 70 palm trees. Why do you think 12 springs of water? 12 tribes of Israel and 70 palm trees, the descendants of Joseph, or of Jacob. Now from there, in chapter 16, the people come to a wilderness or a desert place called the Wilderness of Sin. And again, if you look at chapter 16, verse 2, the whole Israelite community grumbled against Moses and Aaron. And they say in verse 3, if only we had died at the Lord's hand in the land of Egypt, as we sat by our kettles of meat and ate our fill of bread. But you, pointing to Moses, have led us into this wilderness to make this whole assembly die of famine. Now think of that. They would really rather be slaves as long as they had something to eat, rather than to be free and find themselves inconvenienced with nothing to eat. It's at this point that, again, God provides for the people. Just as in the earlier episode, when they came to the bitter waters, God changed those waters into fresh waters. Now you have this magnificent miracle of what is called the miracle of the manna. So the people grumble. You'll find the same verb in chapter 16, verse 7, where Moses says to the people, who are we, namely Aaron and I, that you, the people, should grumble against us? And then he says in verse 8, your grumbling is not against us, but it's really against the Lord. And then in verse 17, the Lord says to Moses, I've heard the grumbling of the Israelites. So they're being portrayed as a people, despite all of the salvation they've experienced from God, they continue to grumble. So God gives them this miracle of the manna, and exactly what it is not clear, but it's some sort of a flaky bread-like crust that comes on the ground every morning so that they can gather it and eat it. And eventually, this says they will eat, God will sustain them with this manna from heaven for 40 years. But again, God tests the people. I'm still in chapter 16, and he tells them, just gather enough for what you need. But some people don't trust God, so they gather more just in case, and so it just turns, it becomes, turns into, it spoils. It spoils. And then God tells them, you gather it for 6 days, but you don't gather it on the 7th day, the Sabbath, but rather on the 6th day, you gather a double portion. But some people, again, don't trust God. They go looking for the manna on the Sabbath, and it is not there. So all of these episodes, these 3 episodes, the grumbling of the people at Marah, the complaining in the wilderness of sin, and then complaining that they don't have this food, all of it is portraying the people as a people who essentially are always complaining and grumbling against Moses and Aaron, and so eventually against God. There then follows a small episode in chapter 17, and another episode in chapter 17, where they come to a place called Rephidim. And again, they have no water. So I'm in chapter 17, verse 2. But there was no water for the people to drink. And so they quarreled with Moses. And they said, give us water to drink. And Moses replies to them, why do you quarrel with me? Why do you put the Lord to the test? Here then is in their thirst for water. The people grumbled against Moses, saying, why did you bring us out of Egypt to have us die of thirst with our children and our livestock? So again, God provides for the people. He tells Moses to take his staff and simply to touch the rock, and water comes out of the rock. St. Paul picks up this imagery later on in his letter to the Romans, and he talks about the rock that followed Israel throughout the wilderness, and from which they drank, and he says that rock was Christ. So he sees the rock is already portraying Christ. So I'm in chapter 17, verse 7. The place was named Massah and Meribah. Why? Because the Israelites quarreled, Massah, and they tested Meribah, the Lord, saying, is the Lord in our midst or not? So you have these 3 episodes, the grumbling at Marah, grumbling in the desert of Sin, and grumbling against Moses at Rephidim. And every time, however, God provides for the people. Then you have this story of the battle with Amalek. These are a people who are at the edge of the promised land. And God tells Moses to choose Joshua and go out and battle against Amalek. And now Moses is going to be portrayed as an intercessor for the people. Moses himself doesn't go out to fight in this battle, but while the people are fighting against against Amalek, Moses lifts up his hands as an intercessor. And as long as he lifts up his hands, the battle goes in favor of the Israelites. But as the day gets on, his hands get tired, and then the battle goes badly, and so Joshua and have to lift up his arms. And again, the fathers of the church saw this as a prefiguration of who, do you think? Christ and the cross, who makes intercession for us. In chapter 18, Moses' father-in-law hears about all that Moses is doing. His father-in-law is named Jethro. We met him in the very first week. And evidently Moses had sent back his wife, Zipporah, and his 2 sons to his father-in-law Jethro once he began this great work of redeeming the people. But now the father-in-law has heard about all the things that the Lord has done for Moses and the Israelites, and he comes out to see Moses, and he brings Moses his wife, Zipporah, and his 2 children. And the father-in-law at one point also provides Moses with some very good advice. Moses is doing everything himself. Okay, and he doesn't have enough assistance to help him. He's trying to judge all of the cases, and the father-in-law Jethro says that this is not good. You're going to kind of wear yourself out. So he says, choose 70 people who are wise and let them help you in all of this. All of this now brings us to Mount Sinai. The people have finally come to Mount Sinai. They've been wandering in the wilderness. They've grumbled against God, but in every instance, God has provided for them. They've had this battle with the Amalekites, and now where they've been victorious, and now they come to Mount Sinai. So here I'm going to read more of the text. So I'm in chapter 19 now. In the 3rd month after the Israelites' departure from the land of Egypt on the first day, they came to the wilderness of Sinai. And after they had made the journey from Rephidim, they entered the wilderness of Sinai and then pitched their tents in the wilderness. So they've been in the wilderness just about 3 months, and they come to the same mountain where Moses, remember, had seen the burning bush. We talked about that the first week. Now, it's at this point that Moses goes up to the mountain for the first time. We'll notice that Moses is going to go up to this mountain several times. And the Lord called, I'm in chapter 19, verse 3, Moses went up the mountain of God. Then the Lord called to him from the mountain, saying, this is what you are to say to the house of Jacob. Tell the Israelites, you have seen how I have treated the Egyptians, and how I have borne you up on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now, if you obey me completely and keep my covenant, you will be my treasured possession among all the peoples, though all the earth is mine. You will be to me a kingdom of priests, a holy nation. So in effect, God is telling Moses and the people that they're going to be his chosen people. He's going to elect them, and the entire people, will be like a kingdom of priests. They will be the priest, if you will, to all the other nations of the world. So this is the beginning of the story of the election of Israel. And you might stop at this moment and say, well, why does God choose this people? Why didn't God choose the Babylonians? Why didn't he choose the Egyptians? Why did he choose Israel? And there's no reason given. It's just pure grace. God has decided to use this people through which he'll show his glory to the rest of the world. I've told you this little poem before by Ogden Nash. You know, Ogden Nash writes these short poems, and here's his poem. How odd of God to choose the Jews. Yeah, on the one hand, it's very funny, how odd of God to choose the Jews. And yet it's very profound. I mean, God could have chosen any people. He could have chosen the Romans and the Greeks, but no, God chooses the Jews, the Israelites, to be his holy people, a kingdom. The whole nation will be a kingdom of priests who will minister to the rest of the world. And so God goes on and tells Moses, this is what you are to tell the Israelites. Chapter 19, verse 7. So Moses then summons the elders of the people, and the people who up to this point have not shown themselves distinguished themselves very well with all their grumbling. In verse 8 they say, everything the Lord has said, we will do. So Moses then brings back to the Lord the response of the people. So he has gone up to the mountain. God has told him that if the people are obedient to all that he says and does, they'll be his chosen and elect people. They'll be a kingdom of priests. Now, I'm still in verse 9. Then the Lord said to Moses, I'm coming to you now in a dense cloud, so that when the people hear me speaking with you, they will remain faithful to you. So the people themselves are going to see this theophany. Up to this point, only Moses has seen God in the burning bush. Now the entire nation will see God at the same place Moses originally saw God. So God tells Moses to have the people sanctify themselves for the day. They're to wash their garments. They're to be ready for the appearance of God. They're to set limits around the mountain, and they're to be careful not to touch the edge of the mountain, because the mountain is holy, because God is present there, and the holy God is a dangerous God. If you get too close to the holiness of God without God inviting you into that holiness, you will be destroyed. So set limits for the people all around, verse 12, saying, taking care not to go up the mountain or even to touch its edge. All who touch the mountain must be put to death. No hand shall touch them, but they must be stoned to death or killed with arrows. Whether human being or beast, they must not be allowed to live. So Moses then comes down to the mountain to the people. He tells them all of this, and he says, sanctify yourself for 3 days. Wash yourself. Don't touch anything that is ritually impure. Don't dare go near the mountain, because God is about to appear. Now, this all may seem very strange to us. It would not have been strange to Moses and the people of Israel, and it's probably a good reminder to us of the total otherness of God. The total otherness of God is God's holiness. And, God is often described as a consuming fire. And just as you get too close to the fire, you will be burnt. If you get too close to the whole holy God without being invited into that holiness, you are going to die. So I think it's an important reminder that God is far beyond our ordinary understanding. Now, starting with verse 16, we now have the great theophany takes place. And you get the sense that the theophany is almost like the eruption of a volcano, or a great thunderstorm is happening around the mountain. chapter 19, verse 16, on the morning of the third day. Again, it's kind of significant. It's the third day. So on the third day, Jesus rises from the dead. There were peals of thunder, lightning, and a heavy cloud over the mountain, and a very large blast of the shofar, a great trumpet, so that the people in the camp trembled. But Moses led the people out of the camp to meet God and stationed themselves at the foot of the mountain. Now the Mount Sinai was completely enveloped in smoke, because the Lord had come down upon it in a fire. The smoke rose from it as though from a kiln, and the whole mountain trembled violently. Now the next verse is very interesting. The blast of the trumpet, the shofar, grew louder and louder while Moses was speaking to God, and God was answering with thunder. Now this is a very different picture of Moses. At the beginning of the book of Exodus, he was a reluctant hero. Now he's becoming the mediator of the people, and in the midst of the people, he's speaking with God. So Moses is speaking, and God is responding in this huge thunderstorm. And the people are witnessing this. Now, in verse 20, the Lord summons Moses to the top of the mountain again. I again think at this point Moses must have been in great shape for 80, because he's going up and down this mountain. And again, God warns Moses not to let the people get too close to the mountain. And then in verse 24, the Lord tells him, go down the mountain and come up again with Aaron. But don't let the people get too close to the mountain. It's at this point in verse 20 that the Lord speaks the words of what we traditionally call the Ten Commandments, though they are not called explicitly the Ten Commandments at this point. So the picture is this. Moses and the people have sanctified themselves for 3 days. Then God comes down on the mountain in a cloud and in fire. God speaks with Moses. Moses speaks with God. God responds in all of these magnificent ways. And now God pronounces the Ten Commandments, and one gets the sense, it's not clear here, that God is speaking these Ten Commandments in the hearing not only of Moses, but of all the people, all right? Now, Catholics and Orthodox and Protestants divide the Ten Commandments differently, all right? And if you look at them here, it's kind of hard to say, you know, where to divide them. I first learned the Ten Commandments, I think, in 4th grade. Maybe you did too. I am the Lord your God. You shall not have strange gods before me. You shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain. Remember to keep holy the Sabbath day. Honor your father and mother. You shall not kill. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not steal. You shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife. You shall not covet your neighbor's goods. That's what we learned from the Baltimore Catechism. I could not memorize that today, but, you know, because I memorized it in 4th grade, and that's why it's important for little kids to memorize at an early age. But now, there's a difference between the way some Protestants take the Ten Commandments. Let's read the first one. Then God spoke all these words, probably in the hearing of all the people, not just in the presence of Moses. It begins with an introduction of who God is. I am Yahweh, your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. So, first of all, an identification of who the God is who is entering into a covenant with them. You shall not have other gods beside me. So the reason that they are not to worship any other gods is because it's the Lord, it's Yahweh, who brought them out of Egypt. Now, at this point, many Protestants begin a second commandment. You shall not make for yourself an idol or a likeness or anything in the heaven above or on the earth below, in the waters beneath the earth. You shall not bow down before them or serve them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, inflicting punishment for their ancestors' wickedness on the children of those who hate me, down to the third and the fourth generation, but showing love down to the 1,000th generation of those who love me and keep my commandments. Protestants, Catholics and Lutherans view all of verses 2 to 6 as one commandment. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt. You shall not have another God beside me, and you shall not make idols, etc. We tend to see that as one big commandment. Now, the important thing here is the commandment not to make any idol or likeness of God. And the reason is that God cannot be portrayed in any other way. All idols that the other peoples make are an attempt on the part of the people to make an image of God so that they can have an image of God in their mind. And next week, we'll see the great apostasy of Israel when Israel does make an idol of God, the golden calf. But what's going on here is that God is so totally other that you really can't imagine what God is like. So don't make a likeness of him in any way. And those who do are liable to punishment. The second commandment, at least in the way I would order them, you shall not invoke the name of Yahweh your God in vain, for Yahweh will not leave unpunished anyone who invokes his name in vain. What that probably means is that you shall not use the name of God, Yahweh, in an oath that is false. So, by Yahweh, I swear that I didn't do this. Or by Yahweh, I swear that this person did this. So you're not to swear, it's not a prohibition against profanity, as we normally think of it, but it's a prohibition against using God's name in order to give false witness. If you're going to use God's name, you have to use it correctly and give only true witness. The third commandment deals with the Sabbath, and like the first commandment, it's rather long. Remember the Sabbath day. Keep it holy. 6 days you may labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath of the Lord your God. You shall do no work, either you, your son or your daughter, your male or female slave, your work animal, or the resident alien within your gates. Why? Because for 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea and all that is in them. Little summary of the book of Genesis. But on the seventh day he rested. That is why the Lord has blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. Now, this is a very important commandment for Israel. And it's an important commandment for Israel because it's supposed to be an imitation of what God himself did. God himself rested on the seventh day, the Sabbath, after the work of creation. And so human beings are to do the same thing. They are to rest every seventh day. The Sabbath then becomes a gift from God. It's a gift of a time of rest and relaxation. And it also is a reminder that the whole purpose of life is not work, but rather the purpose of work is to enjoy life. In a sense, we've lost the sense of Sabbath, whether you think of the Sabbath as originally it was Saturday or Sunday. We've just lost the sense of the Sabbath. Sunday becomes like any other day. We do as much work on Sunday, maybe more, because than we would on any other day, and we lose the whole sense of the gift of the Sabbath. And we're no longer imitating the Creator at that point. Then the fourth commandment has a promise attached to it. Honor your father and your mother. Why? That you may have a long life in the land that the Lord your God is giving you. So those speaking to the community of Israel, they will enjoy a long life in the promised land, provided they honor and respect their parents. The other commandments: you shall not kill, referring more to murder, of course. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not steal. You shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. And then, at least in the Catholic ordering of these commandments, the seventh, verse 17 is usually divided into two commandments. You shall not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife. That's usually seen as the ninth commandment. His male or female slaves, his ox or donkey, or anything else that belongs to your neighbor. So you shall not covet or want your neighbor's goods. So this is the basic law that God gives to the people of Israel. These are the basic stipulations of the covenant. Notice they're not yet written in stone. Moses will receive the stone tablets later on. Now, in verse 18, the stature of Moses grows, because as the people witnessed the thunder and the lightning, the blast of the shofar, and the mountains smoking, they became afraid and they trembled, and they took up a position further away. And they said to Moses, "You speak to us, you speak to us, and we will listen. But do not let God speak to us, or we shall die." Moses answered the people, "Do not be afraid, for God has come only to test you and put the fear of him upon you, so that you do not sin." So the people remained at a distance while Moses approached the dark cloud where God was. Now at this point, Moses now is becoming a powerful, powerful figure. He becomes the mediator between God and the people. The people know they can't stand in the presence of God and listen to God. Not because they don't want to, but they are fearful that if they do, if they go into God's presence and listen to the words of this totally holy and fearsome God, they will die. So they need a mediator between them and God, someone who will bring the word of God to them, and that's who Moses becomes. Now, I'm going to skip ahead for a moment and then come back. I want to show you something. if you skip all the way to chapter 24 for a moment, in chapter 24, Moses is going to ratify the covenant that God makes with the people. And he's going to ratify it by taking the blood of goats and bulls and pouring it into a bowl and pouring half the blood on the altar and the other half of the blood on the people as a sign of that they are now in a covenant relationship with God. We'll come back to that in a moment. But before this happens, God is going to give the people of Israel a book of the covenant, or a code of laws that they are to follow. In this book of the covenant, these covenant laws, you'll see from my handout, are found in chapter 19, verse 22, all the way to chapter 23, verse 33. I'm not going to read all of that, but I'm going to read just parts of it so you'll see what's going on here. So in chapter 20, in verses 18 to 20, the people have asked Moses to be their mediator. They are correctly fearful of God. Fearful not in the sense of being afraid, but in the sense of total awe in the presence of the all-holy God. Then in chapter 20, verse 21, the Lord, Yahweh, says to Moses, "This is what you are to say to the Israelites," because he's now the mediator. "You, the people, have seen for yourselves that I have spoken to you from heaven." They've just witnessed this theophany. "You shall not make alongside of me gods of silver, nor shall you make for yourself gods of gold. An altar of earth make for me, and sacrifice upon it your burnt offerings and communion sacrifices, your sheep and your oxen. In every place where I cause my name to be invoked, I will come to you and bless you. But if you make an altar of stone for me, do not build it out of cut stone, but by putting a chisel to it, you will profane it. You shall not ascend to my altar by steps, lest your nakedness be exposed." And then God gives this covenant code, and you can see what it consists of. It consists of a series of laws about how you're to deal with slaves. It deals with a series of laws regarding personal injury, property damage, trusts and loans, a series of social laws, religious laws, and feasts. Now, these laws kind of come from a later time, and while they may at first seem very primitive to us today, they were very well thought out laws that helped the people to deal with the situation in which they were living. So let me just give you two examples so you see what I'm talking about. Let's take the law regarding slaves. We all today know slavery is wrong. And the Bible, this literature is written 3,000 years ago in a culture where slavery was taken for granted. But how are you to deal with your slaves? So that's what this is about. So I'm in chapter 21. "These are the ordinances you shall lay before them," the people. "When you purchase a Hebrew slave, he is to serve you for 6 years. But in the 7th year, he shall leave as a free person without any payment." But now you have complicating factors. "If he comes into service alone, he shall leave alone. If he comes into service with a wife, his wife shall leave with him. But if his master gives him a wife, and she bears him sons or daughters, the woman and her children belong to her master, and the man shall leave alone. If, however, the slave declares, I love my master and my wife and children, I will not leave as a free person, his master shall bring him to God, and there at the door or the doorpost he shall pierce his ear with an awl, thus keeping him as a slave forever. Now, it's a different world, but notice this is a very carefully crafted law. You can have a slave, but for 6 years, and then you release the slave. But what happens if the slave gets a wife in the meantime? Well, if the master gave him the wife, the master keeps the wife. If he came into slavery with the wife, then he goes out of slavery with the wife. So it's actually a kind of a humane law if you have to presuppose slavery and how to deal with a slave. From that point of view, it makes sense. Now let's look at some social laws. Chapter 22, verse 15. When a man seduces a virgin who is not betrothed, and he lies with her, he shall make her his wife by paying the bride price. If her father refuses to give her to him, he must still pay him the bride price for virgins. Now, first of all, it may seem strange that the man should get her as his wife, but it's kind of humane in this world, because if the woman has been seduced, then nobody's going to take her, you see, in this world. And so they're making provision for that. You shall not let a woman who practices sorcery live. Anyone who lies with an animal shall be put to death. Whoever sacrifices to any god, except the Lord alone, shall be put under the ban, that is to say, destroyed. You shall not, now all of those laws are very severe. They just presuppose what we call the death penalty. But now notice this law in verse 20. You shall not oppress or afflict a resident alien. Why? Because you were once aliens residing in the land of Egypt. You shall not wrong any widow or orphan. If ever you wrong them, they cry out to me, and I will surely listen to their cry. My wrath will flare up, and I will kill you with the sword. Then your own wives will be widows, and your children orphans. In other words, God's concern for the poor and the orphan. If you lend money to my people, the poor among you, you must not be like a money lender. You must not demand interest from them. And if you take your neighbor's cloak as a pledge, you shall return it to him before sunset, for this is the only covering, for this is his only covering. It is a cloak for his body. So these kinds of laws are different. They, much more humane. These are simply laws that these laws represent the culture of that time. Doesn't mean that we today have to follow these particular laws 3,000 years later, but you see how they're functioning in that society. Now, at the end of the covenant code, in chapter 23, verse 20, God now tells the people what will happen if they're faithful to the covenant. So I'm in chapter 23, verse 20. See, I'm sending an angel before you to guard you on the way and bring you to the place I have prepared. Be attentive to him and obey him. Do not rebel against him, for he will not forgive your sin. My authority is within him. If you obey him and carry out all I tell, I will be an enemy to your enemies, a foe to your foes. My angel will go ahead of you and bring you to the Amorites, the Hittites, etc. Therefore you shall not bow down to their gods and serve them. You shall serve the Lord your God. He will bless you with food and drink. I will remove sickness from your midst. No woman in your land will be barren or miscarry. So all kinds of blessings that will come down upon the people if they observe the covenant code. Why? Because by observing the covenant code, they are being obedient to God. Once God has told Moses the covenant code, Moses now reads the code to the people and ratifies the covenant between them and God. So Moses, I'm in chapter 24, verse 1. Moses himself was told, come up to the Lord, you, Aaron, with Nadab, Abihu, and the 70 elders. So first of all, Moses is told, come up to the mountain again. But before he goes up to the mountain, he comes to the people, verse 3, and he relates all of the ordinances, the laws of this covenant code. And the people, in verse 3, said, we'll do everything that the Lord has told us. Verse 4, Moses then wrote down all the words of the law, and rising early in the morning, built at the foot of the mountain an altar and 12 stones for the 12 tribes. Then, having sent young men of the Israelites to offer burnt offerings and sacrifices, he took half the blood and put it in large bowls. The other half he splashed on the altar. Taking the book of the covenant, he read it aloud to the people, who answered, all that the Lord has said we will do. Then he took the blood and splashed it on the people, saying, this is the blood of the covenant that the Lord has made with you. So now the covenant is ratified by blood. Moses reads the laws, the covenant code. The people agree to them. Moses splashes half the blood on the altar, the other half on the people, as a sign that they are now joined to God in a covenant. Now notice at Mass we talk about the blood of the new covenant. We are in a new covenant, and the blood of the new covenant is the blood of Christ. After that, Moses and Aaron and Nadab and Abihu and the elders go up to the mountain, and they eat and they drink in the presence of God, and they see God, verse 11, and they don't die, because God has invited them into his presence. But Moses is different from all of them, and in chapter 20, verse 4, verse 12, God then says to Moses, come up to me on the mountain. While you are there, I will give you the stone tablets. So he now invites Moses more closely to him, because he's going to take those words that we call the 10 Commandments, and God is going to inscribe them on 2 tablets and give them to Moses. So Moses set out with Joshua, his assistant. He went up to the mountain, and he told the elders, wait here for us until we return. So Moses goes up the mountain, and a cloud covers the mountain. The glory of the Lord settles on the mountain. The cloud covered it for 6 days. And then on the 7th day, God calls Moses into the midst of the cloud. In verse 18, and Moses enters into the midst of the cloud and went up on the mountain, and he's on the mountain for 40 days and 40 nights. And that's where we're going to end tonight. But why is he on there 40 days and 40 nights? Well, 2 things are going to happen. First of all, God is going to inscribe on stone the 10 Commandments. But then during this period, and you'll see this in chapter 25 to 31, God gives Moses very precise instructions how to build the tent or the tabernacle where God is going to dwell with the people. It's about 6 chapters, very, very precise instruction. This is how you're to build it, and then I'm going to dwell there, and I'll be in the midst of the people. Now, that's what we're going to talk about next week, but also we're going to talk about how the people, while Moses is on the mountain for 40 days, they say, what's happened to this man? They're going to ask Aaron to make an image of God, the golden calf. Moses is going to come down with the 2 tablets and smash them on the ground. God is going to tell the people, I'm not going to go with you anymore. Moses is going to have to bargain with God, say, you've got to go with us. Then he's going to have to go up to the mountain again and get the tablets again, all right? So it gets kind of complicated, but we'll talk about that next week. So let me just draw some conclusions. Israel's first period in the desert, in other words, prior to the theophany, it foreshadows how Israel is going to disobey Moses and God later on. Because after Moses comes down from the mountain again, then the people are going to spend 40 years wandering in the wilderness. And that story is told pretty much in the book of Numbers. And they will show themselves to be a stiff-necked and rebellious people despite all that God does for them. The theophany at Mount Sinai is the great moment of revelation of God to the people. Earlier, God had shown himself to Moses at Horeb, Mount Sinai, at the burning bush. Now that Moses has led the people out of Egypt and brought them to Horeb, or Mount Sinai, God shows himself in a spectacular way to the entire people. Thirdly, by revealing himself to the people, God enters into a covenant so that they become God's special people. Up to this point, they're just a group of slaves who have been set free from Egypt. Now they become God's people, God's chosen people. They're set apart. They're supposed to be different from all the nations of the world, set apart like priests are in their holiness. Why? Because through them, God is going to bring a blessing to the entire world. Fourthly, God calls upon the people to respond to the covenant by obeying the 10 Commandments and the Code of the Covenant. So how do the people show their loyalty to God? How will they be able to show their loyalty to God and stay in the covenant? By obeying what we call the 10 Commandments and this covenant code. Fifthly, the covenant is ratified by the blood of bulls, which is splashed over the altar and the people. Blood is the sign of life. And by splashing this blood over the people and then the altar, which represents God, it shows the unity of God and the people. Sixth, we see that Moses is now becoming a very powerful figure. There's no more self-doubt the way there was at the beginning. He becomes the great mediator between God and the people. Not only has God made him the mediator, the people want him to be the mediator. And then lastly, the people are no longer just a group of slaves who have been freed from Egypt. They've become God's people, a priestly people, a royal nation through whom the covenant made with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob will be fulfilled. Rick?
This is very different from the movie in several respects.
It is, yeah.
But what I'm fascinated by is, and maybe I never appreciated it before, the difference between this code and the Ten Commandments. I mean, it seems like some of them could have been commandments, like thou shalt not lend money at interest. So what is the distinction between the code and the commandments?
Yeah, the distinction is what we call the Ten Commandments are apodictic laws. That means you shall not. There's no in between. There's no conditions laid down there. You shall not kill. You shall not steal. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife. But the Book of the Covenant is, as in a lawyer, you would appreciate, it's all case law. Much of it is case law. Okay, what do you do with a slave after the 6-year period of slavery is ended? There's other cases. What do you do if your ox gores somebody else? So they're like, it's trying to adjudicate cases, a case law. And it's really, this Book of the Covenant is the kind of law that probably grew up at a much later period, but the Book of Exodus puts it back into this period to make it clear that the law ultimately comes from God. Okay, you know, in other words, it's very clear to all of us, you know, that the Ten Commandments are they're seen as coming directly from God. This case law, which was developed later, probably comes from a later, much later period, but now the Book of Exodus puts it here to say this is God's law. And there's more laws in what we call the Pentateuch or the Torah. The Book of Deuteronomy is filled with other laws.
By the same token, is violating a code provision the same as not following the commandment?
From the point of view of the biblical text, yes. These laws are all God's laws, so they're all to be taken with the same seriousness. You know, we often think of law as kind of constricting and not allowing us to do what we want to do. But it's not the way the biblical authors look at the law. They see the law as grace. It's a revelation of God's will. And once you know what God wants you to do, then you can live in total freedom. Okay? So it's a very different way of looking at the law. If you know what God's will is, then you know how to act. You're the freest of all people.